modern wars might seem horrific, but for Aztec warriors, battle was only the beginning. The real horror started after they won, because their purpose in war wasn't to kill, but to capture alive. And what happened to those captured was beyond imagination's cruelest reach. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the sprawling city of Tenochtitlan, where floating gardens stretched across shimmering lakes and massive pyramids pierced the sky like stone daggers, a child's birth was never just a celebration. It was a prophecy of blood. When an Aztec baby drew his first breath, the priests didn't wonder if he would become a warrior. They wondered how many hearts he would cut from living chests before his own stopped beating. The moment a male child emerged from his mother's womb, the midwife would catch him in hands already stained with ritual blood. She would wash the infant clean, then place in his tiny fist a miniature shield and 4 arrows. These weren't toys, they were promises. The shield would protect him in battle. The arrows would find enemy hearts, and if the gods smiled upon him, he would live long enough to see both prophecies fulfilled in rivers of crimson. The midwife would then speak the words that would haunt the child's entire existence. You have come to suffer. Your home is not here. Your true home is on the battlefield. You have been sent to give the sun the blood it craves, and to feed the earth with the flesh of your enemies. Even as the baby's eyes remained closed to the world, his fate was already sealed in ceremonies older than memory. Within hours of birth, the child's umbilical cord would be cut by an obsidian blade, the same volcanic glass that would one day slice open enemy chests. But this cord wouldn't be discarded like medical waste. It would be dried, wrapped in cotton, and buried in a place where battles had been fought. The Aztecs believed this ritual would ensure the child's courage would grow from soil already fertilized with warrior blood. As the infant grew into a toddler, his world was shaped by the constant presence of death. Aztec homes weren't filled with colorful toys or peaceful lullabies. They were decorated with skulls, weapons, and vivid murals depicting hearts being torn from screaming captives. Children learned to sleep surrounded by images of sacrifice, their dreams filled with the sounds of ritual drums and the sight of blood flowing down temple steps like sacred rivers. By the age of 3, boys were given toy weapons carved from wood and taught to thrust them into straw figures dressed as enemy warriors. They learned that hitting the head was wasteful. The chest was the target, always the chest, because that's where the heart lived, and the heart was what the gods demanded. These games weren't meant to be fun. They were rehearsals for murder. The selection process for warrior schools began when boys reached their 6th birthday. Families would gather before painted screens that told the stories of great battles, and priests would examine each child for signs of warrior potential. They looked for specific characteristics: steady hands that didn't tremble, eyes that didn't flinch when shown images of sacrifice, and most importantly, the ability to watch a live chicken being killed without crying or turning away. Those who passed these tests were divided between 2 schools: the Telpakali, or House of Youth, trained commoners who would become regular foot soldiers. These schools taught basic combat skills, weapon maintenance, and the fundamental principle that death in battle was the highest honor any man could achieve. Students learned to march in formation, to follow orders without question, and to see enemy soldiers not as human beings, but as offerings that walked on 2 legs. The elite Kalmyk schools were reserved for noble children, and those who showed exceptional promise for leadership. Here, the training was far more sophisticated and infinitely more brutal. Students not only learned advanced combat techniques, but also the religious significance of every aspect of warfare. They memorized the prayers that must be spoken before killing, the rituals required to properly capture an enemy, and the sacred procedures for presenting prisoners to the temple priest. But the most chilling aspect of Kalmyk education was the philosophical training. Students were taught that the universe itself depended on their ability to provide human sacrifice. They learned that the sun would stop moving across the sky if warriors failed to capture enough prisoners. They were told that earthquakes, famines, and plagues were punishments sent by gods who had been denied their rightful portion of human hearts. The first real test came during a ceremony called the Flowering of Blood. Boys around age 8 would be taken to witness their first human sacrifice. They would stand in perfect silence as prisoners were dragged up the temple steps, their screams echoing off stone walls. The children were forced to watch as obsidian knives sliced through skin and muscle, as beating hearts were torn from open chests, as blood flowed in torrents down pyramid sides. Many children vomited during their first viewing. Some fainted. A few ran away crying for their mothers. But those who stood firm, who watched without flinching as life drained from human eyes, were marked for special training. These children had proven they possessed the emotional numbness necessary to become efficient killers. The psychological conditioning intensified as the years passed. By age 10, boys were required to participate in mock sacrifice ceremonies using captured animals. They learned the precise angle of the knife thrust, the amount of pressure needed to break through ribs, the exact location where the heart could be most easily extracted. They practiced on rabbits, then dogs, then larger animals, always working their way up to creatures that screamed more like humans. Sleep became another tool of indoctrination. Children were awakened before dawn and marched to temple courtyards, where dried blood still stained the stones. They were forced to clean these sacrificial platforms with their bare hands, scraping away the remnants of previous days' offerings. The priests told them this work was sacred, that by touching the blood of sacrifice, they were connecting with the divine forces that governed the universe. Nutrition played a crucial role in warrior development. Young trainees were fed diets heavy in human flesh, usually from prisoners who had been sacrificed in recent ceremonies. The Aztecs believed that consuming the flesh of brave enemies would transfer their courage to those who ate it. Children were told that every bite made them stronger, more fearsome, more capable of victory in future battles. The boys learned songs that celebrated death and violence. They memorized epic poems describing legendary warriors who had captured hundreds of enemies. They were taught dances that mimicked the movements of sacrifice, their young bodies learning to move in rhythm with imagined screams. Music became inseparable from murder. Art became indistinguishable from atrocity. Friendships were actively discouraged among warrior trainees. The priests taught that emotional attachments made soldiers weak, that caring for comrades could lead to hesitation in battle. Boys were encouraged to compete viciously with one another, to see their classmates as potential rivals rather than allies. The most successful students were those who learned to trust no one and feel empathy for nothing. Physical training bordered on torture. Children as young as 7 were forced to carry heavy stones for miles, to run until they collapsed from exhaustion, to endure beatings without crying out. Their hands were deliberately cut and allowed to heal with scars, toughening the skin for weapon handling. Their feet were pierced with thorns to build tolerance for pain. Every aspect of their physical development was designed to create human weapons capable of inflicting maximum damage while enduring tremendous suffering. The transition from childhood to adolescence was marked by increasingly realistic combat exercises. 12-year-old boys were given real weapons and forced to fight against older students in contests that often resulted in serious injuries. Blood was expected. Broken bones were considered normal. Death, while not intended, was accepted as an unfortunate but necessary part of the training process. Mental conditioning reached its peak during adolescence. Teenage warriors in training were required to spend nights alone in rooms filled with human skulls, surrounded by the preserved heads of enemy soldiers. They were told to meditate on death, to embrace it as a friend rather than fear it as an enemy. Many students reported vivid nightmares during this period, dreams filled with images of their own deaths in battle. The most psychologically damaging aspect of the training was the requirement to participate in the torture of prisoners. Teenage students were assigned to assist with the interrogation and execution of captured enemies. They learned to apply pain with scientific precision, to extract information through carefully calibrated suffering, to end lives with ritual efficiency. By the time these children reached fighting age, they had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. They felt no fear in the face of death, no mercy toward enemies, no empathy for suffering. They had been systematically stripped of every emotion except loyalty to their gods and hunger for battle. They were no longer boys who had learned to fight. They were weapons that happened to be shaped like men. The most tragic aspect of this transformation was its irreversibility. Once a child had been molded into an Aztec warrior, there was no path back to normal human existence. The capacity for peace, for love, for simple happiness had been burned out of them as completely as if it had been cut away with an obsidian knife. They would spend their entire lives searching for meaning through violence, finding purpose only in the screams of their victims. As these young warriors prepared for their first real battles, they carried with them not just weapons and armor, but the accumulated trauma of years of systematic brutalization. They had been taught that the universe itself demanded their participation in endless cycles of violence. They believed with religious certainty that their destiny was to kill or be killed in service to gods who thirsted for human blood. The children who had once played innocent games were gone forever, replaced by teenage killers who saw battle not as something to survive, but as the only way to fulfill their sacred purpose. They would march into their first fights not as frightened boys, but as devoted servants of death, eager to prove their worth through the suffering of others. And in the vast temples of Tenochtitlan, the priests smiled as they watched these young warriors prepare for battle. Another generation had been successfully conditioned for slaughter. The gods would be fed, the sun would continue to rise, and the cycle of blood would continue for another generation, until every last drop of innocence had been drained from every last child. The transformation from child to killer required more than just exposure to violence. It demanded a systematic dismantling of human nature itself. In the warrior schools of the Aztec Empire, educators had perfected the art of turning innocent boys into efficient murderers. This wasn't education in any recognizable sense. It was the industrial production of human weapons, refined over generations until the process had achieved a terrifying perfection. The daily routine at both Telpachkali and Kalmyk schools began before dawn, when the air was still cold and the temples cast long shadows across the training grounds. Students were awakened not by gentle bells or calls, but by the sharp crack of obsidian-tipped whips across their backs. Pain was the first lesson of every day, a reminder that comfort was an enemy of warrior excellence. Physical training began immediately. While the boys' minds were still clouded with sleep and their resistance was at its lowest, they were forced to run barefoot across fields of sharp stones, their feet bleeding into the earth that would later nourish the corn they would never live long enough to harvest. The priests taught that blood was the price of strength, that every drop spilled in training would be repaid tenfold in battle effectiveness. Wrestling matches were conducted on platforms surrounded by sharpened stakes. Students learned that a single mistake could mean death, that the difference between victory and defeat was often measured in torn flesh and shattered bones. These weren't sporting competitions designed to build character. They were gladiatorial combats intended to identify which boys possessed the killer instinct necessary for warrior success. The weapon training began with simple clubs and gradually progressed to the sophisticated implements of Aztec warfare. Students learned to wield the macuahil, a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades so sharp they could decapitate a horse with a single swing. But they didn't practice on straw targets or wooden posts. They trained on captured animals, learning to feel the resistance of living flesh, to understand the exact pressure required to slice through muscle and bone. The atlat, or spear thrower, required years of practice to master effectively. Students spent countless hours hurling projectiles at moving targets, developing the accuracy needed to strike a running enemy at distances of over 100 yards. But accuracy alone wasn't sufficient. They also had to learn to aim for non-vital areas, to wound rather than kill, because dead enemies couldn't be taken as prisoners for sacrifice. Shield work was equally complex, involving not just defense but psychological warfare. Aztec shields were decorated with terrifying designs intended to break enemy morale before combat even began. Students learned to paint their shields with images of death gods, dismembered bodies, and rivers of blood. They were taught that fear was a weapon as powerful as any blade, that a terrified enemy was an enemy already half defeated. The most challenging aspect of weapon training was learning to fight while capturing rather than killing. This required incredible skill and restraint, qualities that seemed contradictory in warriors trained for maximum violence. Students practiced using nets, lassos, and specialized clubs designed to incapacitate without causing fatal injuries. They learned to strike with precision, to disable an enemy's legs without damaging vital organs, to render opponents unconscious without crushing their skulls. Combat formations were drilled until they became second nature. Students learned to move as a single organism, each warrior knowing exactly where his companions would be at any moment during battle. They practiced complex maneuvers involving coordinated attacks, strategic retreats, and the systematic herding of enemy forces into capture zones. Individual heroism was discouraged in favor of collective efficiency. The psychological conditioning intensified as students progressed through their training. They were subjected to increasingly sophisticated forms of mental manipulation, designed to eliminate any remaining traces of empathy or moral restraint. Sleep deprivation was used systematically, keeping students awake for days at a time until their judgment became impaired and their resistance to indoctrination weakened. Hallucinogenic drugs played a crucial role in the psychological transformation process. Students were given carefully measured doses of substances derived from peyote, morning glory seeds, and various mushrooms. Under the influence of these drugs, they experienced vivid visions that were interpreted by priests as messages from the gods. These induced hallucinations reinforced the religious justifications for warfare and human sacrifice. The drug experiences were carefully orchestrated to create specific psychological effects. Students would be given hallucinogens and then exposed to images of torture, sacrifice, and death while their minds were in altered states. The priests explained that these visions were glimpses of divine truth, that the gods themselves were showing the students their sacred purpose as instruments of cosmic violence. Mock sacrifice ceremonies became increasingly realistic as students advanced through their training. They participated in elaborate rituals using human-shaped dolls filled with animal blood, learning the precise movements required for different types of sacrifice. They memorized the prayers that must be spoken during each step of the process, the specific angles for knife thrusts, the proper methods for extracting beating hearts. The transition from sacrifice to actual killing was accomplished gradually, almost imperceptibly. Students began by sacrificing small animals while reciting the same prayers used in human ceremonies. They progressed to larger animals, always following the same ritual procedures. By the time they were required to kill human prisoners, the actions felt familiar, routine, almost boring. The first human sacrifice performed by a student was treated as a sacred milestone, a graduation ceremony marking the transition from apprentice to full warrior. The event was surrounded by elaborate rituals designed to reinforce its religious significance. The student would fast for days beforehand, undergo purification ceremonies, and receive blessings from senior priests. The actual killing was performed in front of assembled crowds, with the student warrior playing the starring role in a theater of death. He would climb the temple steps slowly, ceremonially, while drums pounded and crowds chanted. The prisoner, usually weakened by torture and drugs, would be positioned on the sacrificial stone. The student would raise the obsidian knife high above his head, speak the required prayers, and then plunge the blade into the victim's chest. The extraction of the heart required considerable skill and practice. The student had to slice through skin and muscle, break through ribs, and locate the heart while it was still beating. The organ had to be removed intact and held aloft while still pumping blood, creating a spectacular visual effect that drove crowds into religious frenzy. Many students failed on their first attempts, requiring multiple tries to successfully remove a beating heart. The psychological impact of this first kill was profound and permanent. Students reported feeling a mixture of revulsion and exhilaration, horror and religious ecstasy. Many vomited immediately after completing the ceremony. Some fainted from the intensity of the experience, but all of them were fundamentally changed by the act of taking human life in service to their gods. The priests carefully monitored students' reactions to their first kills, identifying those who showed signs of excessive trauma or moral conflict. Students who displayed too much remorse or hesitation were subjected to additional conditioning, including exposure to more frequent sacrifice ceremonies and intensive religious indoctrination. Those who couldn't be successfully reconditioned were quietly eliminated, often becoming sacrificial victims themselves. The most successful students were those who demonstrated not just tolerance for killing, but genuine enthusiasm for it. These individuals were marked for advanced training and eventual leadership positions. They were taught more sophisticated killing techniques, more elaborate ritual procedures, and the complex theological justifications for human sacrifice on an industrial scale. Advanced students learned to read enemy psychology, to identify which prisoners would provide the most spectacular deaths. They studied the various types of sacrifice appropriate for different gods and different occasions. They memorized the calendar of religious festivals, learning which ceremonies required which types of victims and which methods of execution. The training extended beyond individual combat skills to include leadership and organizational abilities. Future war chiefs learned to plan military campaigns not just for territorial conquest, but for maximum prisoner acquisition. They studied the populations of enemy cities, calculating how many captives would be needed for upcoming religious festivals and planning their attacks accordingly. The most elite students were trained in the art of psychological warfare. They learned to use captured enemies' fears against them, to extract information through torture, to break the morale of entire armies through strategic displays of cruelty. They studied the cultural beliefs of enemy peoples, learning which types of death and mutilation would be most terrifying to specific groups. Communication skills were considered essential for warrior leaders. Students learned to speak multiple languages, enabling them to interrogate prisoners from different tribes, and to negotiate surrender terms that maximized captive acquisition. They practiced the rhetoric of intimidation, learning to deliver threats with maximum psychological impact. The final phase of training involved extended campaigns against actual enemies. Advanced students were sent on raids, specifically designed to test their ability to capture prisoners under combat conditions. These weren't training exercises, but real military operations with life or death consequences. Students who failed to meet capture quotas were considered failures, regardless of their individual combat prowess. The successful completion of warrior training marked the beginning of a career dedicated entirely to killing and capturing human beings. Graduates were not just soldiers in any conventional sense. They were highly trained specialists in the systematic production of human suffering. Equipped with the skills, knowledge, and psychological conditioning necessary to turn murder into a religious duty. The most tragic aspect of this educational system was its complete success in achieving its intended goals. The schools consistently produced warriors who were absolutely loyal to their gods, utterly fearless in battle, and completely incapable of seeing their enemies as fellow human beings worthy of mercy or compassion. They had been transformed into perfect killing machines, human in form but utterly inhuman in function. By the time these warriors reached maturity, they had killed so many people and witnessed so much suffering that death had become mundane, routine, even boring. They approached each new battle not with excitement or fear, but with the same workmanlike attitude that a craftsman might bring to his daily tasks. Killing was simply what they did, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. The warrior schools had succeeded in creating exactly what the Aztec Empire required: an endless supply of human weapons, capable of feeding the gods' insatiable hunger for blood, while maintaining the military dominance necessary for imperial expansion. But this success came at a cost that extended far beyond the obvious casualties of war. It required the systematic destruction of human nature itself, the transformation of children into monsters, the creation of a society where murder was not just accepted but celebrated as the highest form of religious devotion. The Aztec universe was a machine that ran on blood, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. According to their most sacred beliefs, the cosmos itself was held together by an intricate network of divine hunger that demanded constant feeding. The gods who had created the world had sacrificed themselves to set the sun in motion, and now they required daily payments of human hearts to keep the celestial machinery functioning. Without this steady stream of sacrifice, the sun would halt in its journey across the sky. The earth would crack apart, and all existence would collapse into primordial chaos. This wasn't a matter of religious interpretation or theological debate. To the Aztecs, the blood debt was as real and measurable as the harvest yields, or the tribute payments from conquered territories. Priests maintained detailed calendars calculating exactly how many hearts would be needed for each day's cosmic maintenance. They tracked the spiritual energy contained in different types of victims, the relative value of warrior blood versus civilian blood, the enhanced potency of hearts removed while still beating versus those extracted after death. The creation myths that justified this cosmic blood economy were taught to every child from birth, repeated in songs and dances, and painted on temple walls in vivid, terrifying detail. According to these stories, the universe had already been destroyed and recreated 4 times. Each previous world had ended in catastrophic violence, when the gods grew dissatisfied with their human creations. The current world, the 5th sun, was destined to end in earthquakes that would devour all living things. Only through constant sacrifice could this final destruction be delayed. The god Huitzilopochtli, the patron deity of war and the primary recipient of human sacrifice, was said to have been born fully grown and armed for battle. His mother, Coatlicue, had conceived him when a ball of feathers fell into her lap while she was sweeping the temple. His older siblings, jealous of this miraculous birth, had attempted to kill both mother and unborn child. But Huitzilopochtli had emerged from the womb wielding weapons of fire and light, slaughtering his siblings in a massacre that painted the sky red with divine blood. This myth served as the template for all Aztec warfare. Every battle was a reenactment of Huitzilopochtli's birth fight. Every enemy soldier was one of the jealous siblings who had to be destroyed to preserve cosmic order. Warriors painted their faces and bodies to resemble their patron god, decorating themselves with symbols of fire and blood and death. They believed that in killing enemy soldiers they were quite literally feeding Huitzilopochtli the energy he needed to continue his eternal battle against the forces of darkness. The sun itself was understood to be Huitzilopochtli in his daytime aspect, fighting a daily battle against the stars and the moon. Each dawn marked his victory over the forces of night. But this victory came at tremendous cost. The god expended enormous amounts of energy in his celestial combat. Energy that could only be replenished through human sacrifice. Without daily offerings of hearts and blood, Huitzilopochtli would grow weak and eventually succumb to his enemy. The sun would fail to rise, and the world would be plunged into eternal darkness. The mathematical precision with which the Aztecs calculated their divine obligations was staggering. Priests used complex astronomical observations to determine the exact quantity of sacrifice needed for different celestial events. Solar eclipses required massive offerings to strengthen the sun god during his temporary defeat. Lunar phases demanded specific types of sacrifice to maintain the balance between light and darkness. The appearance of comets or unusual cloud formations triggered emergency sacrifice protocols designed to appease whatever gods had been offended. The calendar itself was a sophisticated accounting system for tracking divine debts and payments. The Aztec year contained 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 unlucky days when the cosmic balance was particularly precarious. Each day was associated with specific gods who required specific types of offerings. Some days called for the sacrifice of children, whose innocent hearts were considered especially pure. Others demanded the blood of captured warriors whose courage would transfer to the recipient gods. The most elaborate sacrificial requirements coincided with major religious festivals that occurred throughout the year. The festival of Shumalpili, which took place every 52 years, required the sacrifice of hundreds of victims to ensure the successful renewal of the cosmic cycle. The ceremony of Tezcatli involved the year-long preparation and eventual sacrifice of a young man who was treated as the living embodiment of the god Tezcatlipoca. The festival of Okpanistili celebrated the harvest with ceremonies that included the flaying of sacrificial victims whose skins were worn by priests to symbolize the renewal of vegetation. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of Aztec religion wasn't the scale of sacrifice required, but the personal responsibility placed on individual warriors. Each soldier was taught that he carried a direct obligation to the gods, that his failure to capture prisoners for sacrifice could result in cosmic catastrophe. The weight of universal destruction rested on every warrior's shoulders, creating an almost unbearable psychological pressure to succeed in battle regardless of personal cost. Warriors were taught to see themselves as partners in the divine work of maintaining creation. They weren't just soldiers fighting for territory or treasure, but cosmic maintenance workers whose daily labor kept the universe functioning. This grandiose sense of purpose served to justify any level of violence or cruelty. No act was too brutal if it served the cosmic good. No enemy was too innocent if their death would feed the god. The religious education of warriors included detailed instruction in divine anatomy and physiology. They learned which gods preferred which organs, which deities required fresh blood versus dried blood, which ceremonies called for beating hearts versus still hearts. They memorized prayers specific to different types of sacrifice, understanding that the wrong incantation could render an offering useless or even offensive to its intended recipient. The god Tlaloc, who controlled rain and fertility, required the tears of children to produce rainfall. Warriors learned to capture young enemies specifically for drowning ceremonies, understanding that the god would only accept victims who cried genuine tears of terror. The goddess Xochiquetzal demanded the sacrifice of young women during flower festivals, their beauty offered to enhance the goddess's own divine attractiveness. The god Xicpetotec required victims to be flayed alive, their skins worn by priests to symbolize the renewal of vegetation and the changing of seasons. Each deity's specific requirements created specialized markets for different types of victims. Warriors developed expertise in identifying and capturing the exact types of people needed for upcoming ceremonies. They learned to evaluate prisoners not just for their combat value but for their sacrificial potential. A young woman's beauty, a child's innocence, an elderly person's wisdom, all became commodities in the spiritual economy that powered Aztec civilization. The psychological impact of this religious system on warriors was profound and multifaceted. On one hand, it provided absolute justification for any level of violence. Warriors could commit the most horrific atrocities secure in the knowledge that they were performing essential cosmic maintenance. On the other hand, it created enormous pressure to succeed. A warrior who failed to capture sufficient prisoners wasn't just failing himself or his unit. He was failing the entire universe. The priests reinforced these beliefs through sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques. Warriors who expressed doubt about the necessity of sacrifice were subjected to intensive re-education involving sleep deprivation, hallucinogenic drugs, and exposure to increasingly graphic religious imagery. They were shown proof of divine anger in the form of natural disasters, crop failures, and military defeats that were attributed to insufficient sacrifice. Dreams and visions played a crucial role in maintaining religious compliance. Warriors were encouraged to report their dreams to priests, who interpreted them as messages from the gods. Nightmares about cosmic destruction were explained as divine warnings about the consequences of insufficient sacrifice. Dreams of victory in battle were presented as divine approval for planned military campaign. The boundary between religious belief and psychological manipulation became completely blurred. The most devout warriors developed a form of religious obsession that bordered on mental illness. They saw divine omens in every natural phenomenon, interpreted every battlefield event as a message from the gods, and measured their personal worth entirely in terms of the number of prisoners they had captured for sacrifice. These individuals often volunteered for the most dangerous missions, not out of courage but out of desperate need to prove their religious devotion. The tragic irony of the Aztec religious system was that it created the very conditions it claimed to prevent. The constant warfare required to capture sacrificial victims destabilized the empire, created numerous enemies, and ultimately led to the civilization's destruction. The gods, who supposedly required blood to maintain cosmic order, ended up receiving so much blood that the entire social system collapsed under the weight of its own violence. The most psychologically damaged warriors were those who began to question the system, but couldn't escape it. They understood intellectually that the endless killing served no practical purpose, but they remained trapped by a lifetime of religious conditioning. These individuals often developed elaborate personal rituals and superstitions, desperate attempts to find meaning in activities they increasingly recognized as senseless. The priests, meanwhile, became addicted to the power that the sacrificial system gave them. They controlled access to divine favor, determined which warriors had fulfilled their religious obligations, and decided which military campaigns were necessary for cosmic maintenance. This power corrupted them completely, turning religious leaders into bloodthirsty administrators of a supernatural protection racket. As the empire expanded and the number of required sacrifices increased, the entire civilization became trapped in an accelerating cycle of violence. More conquered territories meant more tribute obligations, which required more military campaigns, which produced more prisoners, which enabled larger sacrifices, which convinced everyone that the gods demanded even more blood. The system fed on itself like a cosmic cancer, growing larger and more destructive with each passing year. The warriors who served this system became something unique in human history. True believers in organized mass murder. They weren't motivated by greed or hatred or political ambition, but by genuine religious conviction. They killed because they believed the universe required killing, captured prisoners because they were convinced that cosmic order depended on their success. This made them both more dangerous and more tragic than conventional soldiers, because their violence was driven by the highest possible motives, corrupted into the most horrific possible actions. The art of capturing human beings alive required skills that went far beyond conventional warfare. Where other armies focused on killing efficiently, Aztec warriors had to master the infinitely more complex task of subduing enemies without inflicting fatal damage. They were hunters whose prey walked upright, thought strategically, and fought back with deadly weapons. Success demanded not just physical prowess, but psychological cunning, tactical innovation, and a profound understanding of human nature at its most desperate. The primary weapon of choice for capture operations was the makwashiwutal, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades. But unlike the versions used for killing, capture makwashiwus were modified with blunted edges and specialized striking surfaces designed to render enemies unconscious rather than dismember them. Warriors learned to wield these weapons with surgical precision, striking specific pressure points that would disable without destroying their human merchandise. The obsidian blades themselves represented a technological marvel that European metallurgy wouldn't match for centuries. Volcanic glass could be worked to an edge only a few molecules thick, creating cutting surfaces sharper than modern surgical scalpels. But this incredible sharpness came with corresponding fragility. Obsidian blades would shatter on impact with bone or metal, requiring warriors to carry multiple replacement edges and master the art of rapid weapon repair during combat. Training with the makwashiwutal began with exercises designed to develop impossible levels of control. Warriors practiced striking wooden posts wrapped in cotton padding, learning to gauge the exact force needed to penetrate specific depths without going further. They trained blindfolded to develop an intuitive sense of resistance and impact. They practiced on moving targets, learning to compensate for enemy movement while maintaining precise striking accuracy. The atlat, or spear thrower, provided ranged capabilities essential for capture operations. This ingenious device used leverage to multiply throwing force, allowing warriors to hurl spears with accuracy and power that seemed almost supernatural to enemies. But capture spears were equipped with specialized heads designed to tangle rather than penetrate. Weighted nets, barbed hooks, and entangling cords could disable a running enemy from distances of over 100 yards. Mastering the atlatler required years of dedicated practice. Warriors learned to calculate trajectory, wind resistance, and target movement with mathematical precision. They practiced shooting at moving targets, while running themselves, developing the coordination needed for mobile combat. The most skilled atlatli users could strike a specific limb on a running enemy, disabling their leg muscles while leaving vital organs undamaged. But weapons alone couldn't solve the fundamental challenge of capture warfare. The real art lay in psychology and tactics, in understanding how to break an enemy's will to resist without breaking their body. Aztec warriors developed sophisticated techniques for inspiring terror while avoiding lethal outcomes. They painted their faces and bodies with designs calculated to trigger primal fear responses. They wore costumes that transformed them into living incarnations of death gods, jaguar spirits, and eagle demons. The jaguar warriors represented the elite of Aztec capture specialists. These fighters wore full jaguar skins, complete with heads that covered their own faces like macabre masks. They moved with feline grace, struck with predatory silence, and tracked their human prey with animalistic persistence. Jaguar warriors specialized in night operations, stalking individual enemies through darkness and overpowering them without alerting nearby allies. Eagle warriors dominated daylight operations, using superior mobility and ranged weapons to control battlefield movement. They wore elaborate feathered costumes that allowed them to blend with the sky when attacking from elevated positions. Eagle warriors were master tacticians who coordinated complex maneuvers involving multiple units working together to herd enemies into capture zones. The most sophisticated capture technique was the flower war, or zokimikwistli, a form of ritualized combat that existed primarily to generate prisoners for sacrifice. These weren't conventional military campaigns fought for territory or resources, but elaborate hunting expeditions designed to harvest human beings like crops. Flower wars were conducted according to strict rules that ensured maximum prisoner acquisition while minimizing actual military damage. Flower war protocols required advance notification to enemy cities, giving them time to prepare defensive forces and gather their own capture specialists. The battles were fought on predetermined fields using agreed-upon rules that favored capture over killing. Both sides understood that the primary objective wasn't military victory, but the acquisition of prisoners for their respective sacrifice ceremonies. The psychological complexity of flower wars was staggering. Warriors had to fight with maximum ferocity while simultaneously exercising restraint. They needed to terrify enemies into surrender while keeping them physically intact for later sacrifice. They had to coordinate with allies who might become enemies in future flower wars while competing for individual prisoner quotas. These ritualized conflicts created a bizarre form of professional courtesy among warriors from different cities. Enemies who fought each other in flower wars might encounter each other again in future battles, creating relationships that combined mortal combat with mutual respect. Warriors developed reputations based on their capture skills, earning recognition from enemies as well as allies. The economic aspects of capture warfare created additional complications. Prisoners were valuable commodities, whose worth varied according to their age, health, social status, and anticipated performance in sacrifice ceremonies. Warriors had to evaluate potential captives, like livestock merchants, calculating the relative value of different prisoners while fighting for their own lives. Young, healthy warriors commanded premium prices in the prisoner markets that operated around every major temple. These individuals could be expected to provide spectacular deaths that would enhance the religious significance of sacrifice ceremonies. Children were particularly valuable for certain rituals, their innocence adding spiritual potency to their deaths. Elderly prisoners, while less physically impressive, possessed wisdom and experience that made them appropriate offerings for ceremonies honoring aged deities. The capture process itself required incredible physical skill and emotional control. Warriors had to subdue desperate enemies who fought with the fury of cornered animals, knowing that capture meant certain death. They used specialized techniques borrowed from hunting large game, employing nets, lassos, and coordinated group tactics to overwhelm individual opponents. Nets played a crucial role in capture operations. Aztec engineers developed weighted throwing nets that could entangle multiple enemies simultaneously. These devices required extensive training to deploy effectively, as improper technique could result in the net becoming tangled around the thrower rather than the target. Warriors practiced net throwing until they could accurately ensnare moving targets while running at full speed. Lasso techniques adapted from animal herding were modified for human capture. Warriors learned to throw loops that would tighten around limbs or necks without causing strangulation. They practiced on volunteers who wore protective padding, developing the sensitivity needed to apply just enough pressure to disable without killing. The most skilled lasso users could immobilize multiple enemies in rapid succession. The psychological warfare aspects of capture operations were as important as the physical techniques. Warriors studied the cultural fears and superstitions of enemy peoples, designing their appearance and tactics to exploit specific phobias. They learned enough of enemy languages to shout threats and commands that would maximize terror and confusion. Sound played a crucial role in capture tactics. Aztec armies used conch shell trumpets, wooden drums, and human voices to create cacophonies calculated to break enemy morale. They practiced war cries designed to freeze enemies with fear, coordinated chants that demonstrated unified purpose, and victory songs that demoralized opponents who heard them approaching. The logistics of managing captured prisoners created additional challenges that conventional armies never faced. Prisoners had to be kept alive and healthy during potentially long journeys back to sacrifice centers. They required food, water, and medical attention, but these resources had to be provided while preventing escape attempts and maintaining military discipline. Prisoner escort techniques involved complex formations designed to prevent mass breakouts while allowing for rapid response to individual escape attempts. Guards were positioned to watch each other as well as the prisoners, preventing sympathetic guards from allowing escapes. Prisoners were connected with rope and leather restraints that allowed group movement while making individual flight impossible. The most challenging aspect of prisoner management was dealing with the psychological state of captured enemies. Many prisoners attempted suicide rather than face sacrifice, requiring constant surveillance and intervention. Others fell into catatonic states that made them difficult to transport. Some became so terrified that they lost control of bodily functions, creating sanitation problems that could spread disease throughout the entire group. Medical care for prisoners presented ethical dilemmas that pushed warrior psychology to its limits. Guards were required to keep prisoners healthy enough for sacrifice while simultaneously preparing to watch them be killed in gruesome ceremonies. This created a form of cognitive dissonance that damaged many warriors' mental health, forcing them to care for people they knew they would soon help murder. The most successful capture specialists developed a form of emotional detachment that bordered on sociopathy. They learned to see prisoners not as human beings but as valuable objects that required careful handling. This psychological transformation was necessary for operational effectiveness, but came at enormous personal cost, turning warriors into something barely recognizable as human. The prisoner trade networks that developed around capture operations created a parallel economy focused entirely on human suffering. Professional prisoner dealers moved between cities, buying and selling captives like livestock. They developed expertise in evaluating human merchandise, understanding which individuals would provide the most spectacular deaths for different types of ceremonies. The most tragic aspect of the capture system was its impact on prisoners' families and communities. Unlike conventional warfare, where death provided some form of closure, capture left loved ones in agonizing uncertainty. They knew their relatives were alive, but facing inevitable torture and death, creating a form of anticipatory grief that could last for months or years. The Aztec capture system ultimately created a civilization where the highest military honor came not from defeating enemies, but from successfully hunting other human beings. Warriors measured their success not in battles won or territories conquered, but in the number of living people they had delivered to temple altars. This fundamental perversion of military values created a society where courage was defined by the ability to facilitate murder and honor was earned through the systematic production of human suffering. The Templo Mayor rose from the heart of Tenochtitlan like a mountain of blood-soaked stone, its twin peaks piercing the sky in defiance of both earth and heaven. This wasn't merely a religious building, but a cosmic slaughterhouse designed for the industrial-scale production of human death. Every day, streams of prisoners climbed those steep stone steps, their feet slipping on blood that had never fully dried. Every day, human hearts were torn from living chests and offered to gods whose appetite for suffering seemed infinite. And every day, Aztec warriors stood as both audience and participants in the most elaborate theater of death ever conceived by human imagination. The temple itself was an architectural marvel, engineered specifically for maximum sacrificial efficiency. The twin pyramids rose over 200 feet above the city plaza, their height calculated to ensure that the screams of dying prisoners would carry across the entire urban area. The steep steps, numbering exactly 114, were designed to exhaust victims before they reached the sacrificial platforms, making them easier to control during the final ceremonies. At the summit of each pyramid sat shrines dedicated to different aspects of divine hunger. The northern temple honored Tlaloc, the rain god who demanded the tears of children to produce rainfall. The southern shrine served Huitzilopochtli, the war god whose thirst for warrior blood seemed to increase with every offering. Between these twin peaks lay drainage channels carved directly into the stone, designed to carry the rivers of blood that flowed daily from the sacrificial altars. The sacrificial stone itself was a masterpiece of functional horror. Carved from a single block of volcanic rock, it was shaped to arch the victim's back and thrust their chest upward, making the heart easily accessible to the priest's obsidian blade. The surface was covered with intricate carvings depicting previous sacrifices, the stone itself serving as a historical record written in images of human death. The priests who presided over these ceremonies had been transformed by years of daily killing into something beyond human recognition. Their hair was permanently matted with dried blood, their fingernails grown long and stained black from handling human organs. They moved with the efficient precision of professional butchers, their hands steady from years of practice in the precise art of heart extraction. The high priest, known as the Huitzilopochtli's spiritual deputy, wore robes woven from human hair and decorated with human teeth. His face was painted with a mixture of blood and charcoal that gave him the appearance of a living death mask. Around his neck hung necklaces made from human fingers, each digit representing a life he had personally ended in service to the gods. The preparation of prisoners for sacrifice was itself an elaborate ritual designed to maximize both spiritual significance and public spectacle. Victims were painted with specific colors corresponding to the deity who would receive their hearts. Those destined for Huitzilopochtli were covered in red ochre mixed with human blood. Prisoners intended for Tlaloc were painted blue and decorated with paper flowers that would dissolve in their tears. The procession to the temple began before dawn, when the city was still shrouded in darkness, and the only illumination came from torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone buildings. Hundreds of prisoners, connected by rope networks that prevented individual escape while allowing group movement, were marched through streets lined with cheering crowds who had gathered to witness the day's entertainment. The prisoners themselves displayed the full range of human responses to impending death. Some walked with dignified resignation, having accepted their fate and found peace in the knowledge that their deaths would serve a cosmic purpose. Others struggled against their bonds until the very last moment, their desperate attempts at escape providing additional entertainment for the gathered spectators. Many prisoners had been driven insane by the psychological torture they had endured during their captivity. These individuals stumbled through the procession in catatonic states, their minds having retreated so far from reality that they seemed unaware of their surroundings. Their vacant stares and mechanical movements created an eerie contrast to the vibrant energy of the surrounding crowd. The most heartbreaking prisoners were the children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, who had been captured specifically for ceremonies requiring innocent hearts. These young victims often didn't understand what was happening to them, calling for their mothers as they were dragged up the temple steps. Their cries added a particularly disturbing element to the ceremony, as their genuine terror was considered essential for certain types of divine communication. The warriors who had captured these prisoners were required to attend the sacrifice ceremonies, not as passive observers, but as active participants. They stood in designated areas around the temple base, their faces painted with the same colors as their captured enemies. During the climactic moments of each sacrifice, they would raise their weapons and voice ritual war cries, symbolically participating in the killing even though they weren't directly wielding the obsidian knives. The psychological impact of watching their captured enemies die was complex and devastating. Warriors experienced a mixture of pride in their successful captures and horror at the gruesome spectacle unfolding before them. Many reported feeling a strange sense of connection to their former enemies, as if the act of capture had created a bond that made the subsequent killing feel almost like suicide. The heart extraction itself was performed with theatrical precision, designed to maximize both religious significance and crowd appeal. The victim was positioned on the sacrificial stone with arms and legs held by assistant priests, their chest arched upward to present the heart in the most accessible position. The high priest would raise the obsidian knife high above his head, speaking the required prayers while the crowd chanted responses. The blade would descend with surgical accuracy, slicing through skin and muscle with an efficiency that came from years of daily practice. The priest's hand would plunge into the open chest, locating the heart by touch and severing the connecting vessels with quick, precise movements. The still-beating organ would be extracted and held aloft while blood poured down the temple steps like a red waterfall. The crowd's response to each heart extraction was explosive and immediate. Thousands of voices would rise in ecstatic cheers as the beating heart was displayed, their collective roar echoing off the stone buildings that surrounded the temple plaza. The sight of fresh blood flowing down the temple steps triggered mass religious ecstasy that bordered on collective madness. Different types of sacrifice required different ceremonial procedures, each designed to honor specific divine preferences and maximize spiritual efficacy. Drowning ceremonies for Tlaloc took place in sacred pools, where victims were held underwater until they died from asphyxiation rather than blade wounds. The gods supposedly preferred victims who died surrounded by water, their final breaths bubbling up through the liquid medium that connected earth to sky. Fire sacrifices honoring the sun god involved victims being thrown into massive braziers while still alive, their screams mixing with the roar of flames in a symphony of suffering that was said to please the divine audience. The smell of burning human flesh would fill the temple complex for hours after these ceremonies, creating an olfactory memory that lingered in participants' minds long after the visual images had faded. The flaying ceremonies dedicated to Sipe Totec represented perhaps the most psychologically disturbing rituals in the Aztec ceremonial calendar. Victims were carefully skinned while still alive, their flesh removed in strips that would be worn by priests during subsequent fertility ceremonies. The precision required for this process demanded exceptional skill, as the skin had to be removed intact while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Gladiatorial sacrifices provided a form of ritualized combat that combined entertainment with religious devotion. Captured warriors were given weapons and forced to fight against Aztec champions in ceremonies that recreated mythological battles between gods and demons. These contests were rigged to ensure Aztec victory, but they provided prisoners with the illusion of agency in their final moments. The most elaborate sacrifices coincided with major religious festivals that occurred throughout the year. The ceremony of Xiumolpilli, which took place every 52 years, required the sacrifice of hundreds of victims to ensure the successful renewal of the cosmic cycle. Prisoners were killed in waves throughout the night, their hearts feeding a massive bonfire that represented the rebirth of the sun. The festival of Toxcatl involved the year-long preparation and eventual sacrifice of a young man who was treated as the living embodiment of the god Tezcatlipoca. This individual lived in luxury for an entire year, receiving the finest food, clothing, and entertainment the empire could provide. He was given 4 wives, taught to play musical instruments, and trained in poetry and philosophy. But this privileged existence served only to make his eventual sacrifice more spiritually significant and psychologically devastating for all involved. The economic aspects of large-scale sacrifice created a complex support industry that employed thousands of people throughout the empire. Professional body disposal teams cleared corpses from temple platforms after ceremonies, ensuring that the next day's sacrifices would have clean working surfaces. Blood merchants collected the sacred fluid for use in other ceremonies and medical procedures. Organ dealers distributed hearts, livers, and other body parts to customers who needed them for specific rituals. The scale of these operations was staggering beyond comprehension. Historical accounts suggest that major festivals could consume thousands of victims in single ceremonies. The festival of Huitzilopochtli's birthday reportedly involved the sacrifice of over 10,000 prisoners, Their deaths spread across 4 days of continuous killing that left the temple complex literally swimming in blood. The psychological toll on the warriors who had to witness these mass killings was enormous and cumulative. Many developed what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive memories that made normal life impossible. Some turned to alcohol or hallucinogenic drugs as escape mechanisms, developing addictions that further compromised their military effectiveness. The most tragically damaged warriors were those who began to identify emotionally with their captured enemies. Having spent weeks or months guarding specific prisoners, some warriors developed personal relationships that made watching their eventual sacrifice psychologically devastating. These individuals often requested reassignment to combat units where they wouldn't have to participate in capture operations. The priests, meanwhile, became increasingly detached from normal human emotion. As they performed daily killings that numbered in the dozens or hundreds, they developed a professional callousness that allowed them to function efficiently in their roles, while simultaneously destroying their capacity for empathy or compassion. Many reported feeling more comfortable around corpses than living people. The most disturbing aspect of the sacrificial system was its normalization within Aztec society. Children grew up attending these ceremonies as routine entertainment, their developing minds shaped by constant exposure to industrial-scale killing. They learned to cheer for death, to find entertainment in suffering, to see human slaughter as normal and necessary. The temple complex became a focal point for a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the production and consumption of human death. Every aspect of Aztec society, from military operations to agricultural cycles to artistic expression, was shaped by the demands of feeding an ever-growing sacrificial machine that consumed human lives like fuel. The human mind was never designed to process industrial-scale murder as routine work. Even the most thoroughly conditioned Aztec warriors eventually reached psychological breaking points, where their sanity simply couldn't absorb any more horror. They had been trained from childhood to see killing as sacred duty, capture as cosmic service, and sacrifice as divine necessity. But beneath the layers of religious conditioning and military discipline, something fundamentally human continued to exist, and that human core was slowly poisoning itself on a steady diet of blood and suffering. The first signs of psychological collapse often appeared as sleep disturbances. Warriors who had witnessed hundreds of sacrifice ceremonies found their dreams invaded by the faces of their victims. They would wake screaming in the middle of the night, their bodies soaked in sweat, their minds unable to distinguish between dream memories and actual experiences. The boundary between sleeping and waking became blurred as traumatic images leaked from their unconscious minds into their daily awareness. Nightmares weren't random collections of frightening images, but detailed recreations of specific sacrifice ceremonies. Warriors would relive the exact moment when a particular prisoner's heart was torn from their chest, experiencing the event from multiple perspectives simultaneously. They would see themselves as the victim, feeling the obsidian blade slicing through their own flesh. They would experience the ceremony as the executing priest, feeling the warm blood on their hands. They would watch as spectators, powerless to intervene as familiar faces disappeared into the temple's hungry maw. The most psychologically damaging dreams were those that featured family members or loved ones as sacrifice victims. Warriors would dream of capturing their own children, of watching their wives' hearts being torn from their chests, of participating in the ritualized murder of everyone they cared about. These nightmares served as their unconscious minds' attempts to process the cognitive dissonance between their training and their fundamental human need for connection and compassion. Sleep deprivation became endemic among veteran warriors, creating a cascading series of mental health problems that affected every aspect of their functioning. Chronic fatigue impaired their judgment in combat situations, making them more likely to make mistakes that could result in their own capture and sacrifice. Exhaustion weakened their immune systems, making them vulnerable to diseases that further compromised their military effectiveness. Many warriors turned to alcohol as a means of chemically inducing sleep and temporarily numbing the psychological pain that had become their constant companion. Boca, a fermented beverage made from agave plants, became their drug of choice, but what began as self-medication for trauma symptoms quickly evolved into dependency that created additional problems. Alcohol provided temporary relief from nightmares, but also impaired their ability to function during waking hours. The drinking culture that developed among Aztec warriors was unlike anything seen in other military traditions. They didn't drink to celebrate victories or bond with comrades, but to achieve temporary unconsciousness that would provide respite from memories they couldn't escape. They drank alone in silence, consuming enough alcohol to render themselves completely insensible rather than merely intoxicated. Hallucinogenic substances offered another escape route for warriors whose minds were fracturing under the weight of accumulated trauma. Peyote, sacred mushrooms, and various plant-based psychedelics were readily available and culturally acceptable when used in religious context. But many warriors began using these substances outside of ceremonial settings, seeking chemical relief from psychological pain that no amount of prayer or ritual could address. The hallucinations induced by these drugs often provided temporary relief, by allowing warriors to experience alternate realities where the constant killing stopped, where their victims were still alive, where they themselves had never learned to murder. But these chemical escapes were temporary and often followed by periods of even deeper depression as users returned to their blood-soaked reality. The most tragic cases involved warriors who became addicted to the hallucinogenic experience itself, consuming increasing quantities of psychoactive substances in desperate attempts to remain permanently detached from reality. These individuals would disappear into drug-induced stupors for days or weeks at a time, emerging only when their body's physical needs forced them back to consciousness. Social isolation became another common symptom of psychological breakdown among veteran warriors. The shared experience of mass killing created bonds between soldiers that couldn't be understood by civilians. But these same experiences also made normal human relationships impossible. Warriors found themselves unable to connect with family members who hadn't witnessed the horrors they had seen daily. Conversations with non-military personnel became exercises in performance art, as warriors learned to present facades of normalcy while concealing the psychological chaos that dominated their inner lives. They developed elaborate mechanisms for avoiding discussions of their work, deflecting questions about their experiences, and maintaining the appearance of stability while their minds slowly disintegrated. Many warriors reported feeling more comfortable around corpses than living people. The dead were predictable, unthreatening, and familiar in ways that the living could never be. Some began spending their off-duty time in places associated with death: graveyards, abandoned sacrifice sites, or morgues where temple workers prepared bodies for disposal. The deterioration of family relationships was particularly devastating for warriors who had children. They found themselves unable to show affection or express normal parental emotions, having been conditioned to see all human relationships as temporary and expendable. Many became emotionally absent fathers who provided material support, but couldn't offer the emotional connection their children needed. Domestic violence became common as warriors struggled to control psychological impulses that had been shaped by years of sanctioned brutality. The same training that made them efficient killers also made them dangerous family members. They had learned to solve problems through violence, to respond to stress with aggression, and to see physical force as the appropriate response to any form of resistance or challenge. Some warriors attempted to compensate for their psychological damage by becoming hyper-vigilant protectors of their families. But this protective instinct was often indistinguishable from paranoid behavior. They would barricade their homes against imaginary threats, maintain constant armed watch during peaceful periods, and interpret normal social interactions as potential dangers requiring violent responses. The most psychologically sophisticated warriors developed elaborate philosophical frameworks designed to justify their participation in mass murder. They created complex theological arguments explaining why their actions were necessary, beneficial, and morally superior to peaceful alternatives. These intellectual defenses became increasingly elaborate and divorced from reality as warriors struggled to maintain some sense of moral coherence. But even the most sophisticated rationalization systems eventually collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions. Warriors would witness events that couldn't be explained by their theological frameworks. Innocent children suffering meaningless deaths, brave enemies displaying more humanity than their captors, or natural disasters occurring despite massive sacrificial offerings. The collapse of belief systems was often more psychologically devastating than the original trauma of participating in mass killing. Warriors who lost faith in the religious justifications for their actions were left with no way to make sense of their experiences or find meaning in their suffering. They had committed atrocities in service to gods who appeared to be either non-existent or indifferent to human suffering. Suicide became an increasingly common response to psychological breakdown among veteran warriors. But even in their final acts, they remained trapped by the cultural and religious systems that had shaped their lives. Aztec beliefs about the afterlife meant that suicide wouldn't provide escape from their torment, but would instead condemn them to eternal punishment in cosmic hells designed specifically for cowards and deserters. Some warriors chose more elaborate forms of self-destruction that allowed them to maintain the appearance of honor while achieving their ultimate goal of ending their psychological suffering. They would volunteer for obviously suicidal missions, deliberately expose themselves to enemy fire during battles, or provoke conflicts with superior officers that would result in their execution. The institutional response to widespread psychological breakdown among warriors was to increase the intensity of religious indoctrination and expand the use of psychoactive substances in ceremonial contexts. Military leaders recognized that their soldiers were suffering, but interpreted their symptoms as evidence of insufficient spiritual commitment, rather than normal human responses to abnormal experiences. Priests developed specialized rituals designed to cleanse warriors who displayed signs of psychological distress. These ceremonies involved additional exposure to sacrifice imagery, intensive prayer sessions, and controlled doses of hallucinogenic drugs, administered under religious supervision. The goal was to reinforce the theological framework that justified mass killing rather than address the underlying psychological trauma. The most damaged warriors were often promoted to leadership positions where their emotional numbness and detachment from normal human feeling were considered assets rather than disabilities. They became ideal administrators for the sacrificial system because they could make decisions about human life and death without being influenced by empathy or compassion. These psychologically destroyed leaders created a feedback loop that perpetuated and intensified the system that had damaged them, having lost their own capacity for human feeling. They designed increasingly elaborate and brutal ceremonies that would damage the next generation of warriors in the same ways they had been damaged. The children of veteran warriors grew up in households dominated by traumatized adults who couldn't provide normal emotional support or guidance. These children were often more psychologically damaged than their parents, having been exposed to secondary trauma from birth and lacking any memory of normal human relationships or peaceful conflict resolution. The intergenerational transmission of trauma created a society where psychological damage accumulated over time rather than healing. Each generation was more psychologically dysfunctional than the previous one, more accepting of violence as normal behavior, and more disconnected from basic human emotions like empathy and compassion. The final stage of psychological collapse involved a complete loss of personal identity, separate from the role of warrior killer. Veterans would describe themselves entirely in terms of their body counts, their capture records, and their participation in specific sacrifice ceremonies. They had no sense of themselves as individuals with personal histories, relationships, or characteristics unrelated to their military service. These completely dehumanized individuals became living ghosts who continued to function in their military roles while being essentially dead in every meaningful human sense. They performed their duties with mechanical efficiency but had no emotional investment in the outcomes of their actions. They had become perfect servants of a system that required the destruction of human nature itself. The tragedy of Aztec warrior psychology was that the very qualities that made individuals successful in their military roles also made them incapable of experiencing any form of human happiness or satisfaction. They had been trained to find meaning only through violence, purpose only through killing, and identity only through their ability to cause suffering. Having achieved perfect efficiency in these roles, they had simultaneously destroyed their capacity to be human in any recognizable sense. The ships appeared on the horizon like floating mountains, their white sails billowing in winds that seemed to carry the scent of ending times. To the Aztec lookouts stationed along the coast, these vessels represented something beyond their comprehension. Floating temples filled with pale-skinned gods who rode four-legged beasts and wielded weapons that spoke with thunder. But to the hardened warriors who had spent their lives feeding human hearts to hungry deities, these strangers represented something far more significant than divine visitation. They represented the final test of a civilization built entirely on blood. Hernán Cortés landed on Mexican shores in 1519 with fewer than 600 men, a force so small that any single Aztec military unit could have destroyed it without significant effort. But the conquistadors brought with them weapons, diseases, and tactical approaches that the Aztec warrior system was utterly unprepared to counter. More importantly, they brought a fundamentally different understanding of warfare that rendered centuries of Aztec military evolution obsolete in a matter of months. The first encounters between Spanish soldiers and Aztec warriors revealed the fatal weaknesses inherent in a military system designed primarily for capturing prisoners rather than killing enemies. Aztec tactics emphasized surrounding and subduing opponents, using specialized weapons and techniques perfected over generations for the delicate art of taking captives alive. But the Spanish had no interest in capture. They fought to kill, quickly and efficiently, using steel weapons and gunpowder technology that could destroy multiple enemies simultaneously. The psychological impact of facing European warfare was devastating for warriors who had been conditioned to see combat as a ritualized activity governed by religious and cultural rules. The Spanish ignored these rules completely, killing indiscriminately without regard for age, gender, or social status. They showed no interest in taking prisoners for sacrifice, no respect for the ceremonial aspects of combat, and no understanding of the cosmic significance that the Aztecs attached to warfare. The sound of gunfire alone was enough to shatter the morale of warriors, who had never encountered weapons that could kill from impossible distances with noise like divine thunder. Arquebus and cannon fire created levels of battlefield chaos that Aztec training had never anticipated. Warriors who had spent years learning to maintain formation and execute complex tactical maneuvers found themselves scattered and disoriented by weapons that seemed to strike from the sky itself. Spanish steel proved superior to Aztec obsidian in ways that went beyond simple cutting effectiveness. While obsidian blades were sharper than steel, they were also far more fragile, shattering on impact with metal armor and becoming useless after minimal use. Spanish swords and spears could be used repeatedly without losing their effectiveness, giving European soldiers sustainable advantages in prolonged combat situations. The horses were perhaps the most psychologically devastating element of Spanish military technology. Aztec warriors had never seen mounted cavalry and initially believed that horse and rider were a single supernatural creature. The speed, mobility, and shock impact of cavalry charges broke Aztec formations that had been designed to deal with infantry combat. Warriors who had trained their entire lives to fight human opponents found themselves trampled by animals they couldn't understand or effectively counter. But the most destructive Spanish weapon wasn't made of steel or gunpowder. It was disease. Smallpox, typhus, and other European pathogens spread through the Aztec population like wildfire, killing millions of people who had no natural immunity to old-world illnesses. The epidemic was so severe that entire military units simply ceased to exist as their members died faster than they could be replaced. The disease outbreaks created a cascading collapse of the systems that supported Aztec warfare. Military training schools couldn't function when their instructors and students were dying en masse. Supply networks broke down as the workers who maintained them succumbed to illness. Temple ceremonies that provided spiritual justification for warfare were abandoned as priests focused on treating the sick and disposing of the dead. Emperor Moctezuma II initially attempted to deal with the Spanish through traditional diplomatic and religious channels, treating them as divine visitors who required appropriate ceremonial reception. This fundamental misunderstanding of Spanish intentions allowed Cortés to penetrate deep into the heart of the empire before Aztec leaders realized they were facing an invasion rather than a divine visitation. The capture of Moctezuma by Spanish forces demonstrated the complete inadequacy of Aztec security systems when confronted with enemies who operated outside traditional cultural frameworks. The emperor's guards had been trained to protect against assassins and rival nobles who would follow established protocols for challenge in combat. They were unprepared for foreigners who seized their ruler through deception and held him hostage in direct violation of every understood rule of civilized behavior. The Spanish exploitation of internal divisions within the Aztec Empire revealed another fatal weakness in a system that depended on forced submission rather than genuine loyalty. Cortés quickly identified subject peoples who resented Aztec domination and were willing to ally with anyone who promised liberation from the tribute and sacrifice obligations that had defined their relationship with Tenochtitlan. The Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztecs, provided Cortés with thousands of indigenous allies who understood local geography, military customs, and tactical approaches. These native allies proved far more valuable than Spanish soldiers in many situations, serving as interpreters, guides, and sources of intelligence about Aztec weaknesses and internal conflicts. The Siege of Tenochtitlan represented the final test of Aztec military capabilities under conditions that negated most of their traditional advantages. The city's location on an island in Lake Texcoco had provided natural defenses against conventional attacks. But it became a trap when the Spanish gained control of the surrounding territory and cut off supply lines. The Spanish construction of brigantines, small armed vessels that could operate on the lake itself, neutralized the city's water-based defenses and allowed European forces to attack from directions that Aztec fortifications hadn't been designed to defend. The psychological impact of seeing foreign vessels sailing on their sacred lake was as devastating as the tactical advantages these ships provided. As the siege tightened, Aztec warriors found themselves fighting under conditions that contradicted everything they had been taught about warfare. They were defending rather than attacking, killing rather than capturing, and fighting for survival rather than religious glory. The entire framework of meaning that had sustained them through years of brutal training began to collapse under the weight of circumstances they couldn't control or understand. The breakdown of the sacrifice system during the siege removed the spiritual foundation that had provided psychological support for Aztec military culture. Without regular ceremonies to feed the gods, warriors began to question whether their deities had abandoned them or whether the religious framework that had defined their civilization was fundamentally flawed. Food shortages during the siege forced defenders to abandon many of the dietary customs that had reinforced their warrior identity. The ritual consumption of enemy flesh became impossible when there were no enemies to capture and kill. The ceremonial foods that had marked important military occasions were no longer available. Even basic nutrition became a struggle as the Spanish blockade prevented supplies from reaching the besieged city. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the siege was the gradual realization that the Aztec warrior system had been designed for a type of warfare that no longer existed. Centuries of military evolution had created specialists in capture and sacrifice who were poorly equipped to deal with enemies who fought for total destruction rather than ceremonial victory. Young warriors who had trained their entire lives for roles in a complex religious and military hierarchy found themselves assigned to desperate defensive actions that bore no resemblance to the combat scenarios they had rehearsed. They had learned to coordinate elaborate maneuvers involving hundreds of participants, but the siege required small unit tactics and individual initiative that their training had actively discouraged. Veteran warriors faced an even more profound crisis as they watched the civilization they had devoted their lives to defending crumble around them. They had participated in thousands of sacrifice ceremonies designed to ensure divine protection for their empire. But the gods seemed either powerless or unwilling to intervene against the Spanish invasion. The fall of Tenochtitlan on August 13, 1521, marked not just a military defeat but the complete collapse of a worldview that had sustained Aztec civilization for centuries. The warriors who survived the siege found themselves living in a world where their skills were useless. Their beliefs had been proven false, and their entire cultural identity had been rendered obsolete. The Spanish treatment of captured Aztec warriors revealed the complete incompatibility between European and Mesoamerican approaches to warfare. Where Aztec customs demanded that prisoners be treated as valuable resources destined for sacrifice ceremonies, the Spanish viewed captured enemies as potential laborers to be exploited for economic rather than religious purposes. Many Aztec warriors chose suicide rather than submit to Spanish domination. But even this final act of defiance was denied the religious significance it would have carried in their traditional culture. Spanish priests condemned suicide as a mortal sin that would damn the soul to eternal punishment, robbing even death of the honor and meaning that Aztec warriors had been taught to expect. The survivors faced a future in a colonial system that had no place for the skills and knowledge that had defined their identities. Expertise in capture techniques, sacrifice procedures, and religious warfare became not just useless, but actively dangerous, as Spanish authorities viewed any connection to pre-conquest military traditions as evidence of potential rebellion. The psychological trauma experienced by surviving Aztec warriors was compounded by the complete destruction of the cultural frameworks that might have helped them process their experiences. The temples where they had found meaning were destroyed. The priests who had provided spiritual guidance were dead or converted. The entire system of beliefs that had explained their suffering and provided hope for cosmic justice had been replaced by foreign religious concepts they couldn't understand or accept. Some warriors attempted to preserve elements of their military traditions by incorporating them into Spanish colonial structures, serving as auxiliaries in expeditions against other indigenous peoples. But these roles required them to use their traditional skills in service of the same forces that had destroyed their civilization, creating impossible psychological contradictions that few could resolve satisfactorily. The children of Aztec warriors grew up in a world where their fathers' accomplishments were not sources of pride but reminders of a discredited past. These young people learned Spanish customs and Christian beliefs while simultaneously inheriting the psychological trauma that their parents could neither process nor explain within the new cultural framework imposed by colonial rule. The final tragedy of the Aztec warrior tradition was that its complete failure served to validate Spanish claims about the superiority of European civilization and Christian religion. The very brutality that had characterized Aztec military culture was used to justify Spanish conquest as a civilizing mission that had saved indigenous peoples from their own barbarism. The irony was profound and bitter. A civilization that had organized itself entirely around the production of human suffering was destroyed by invaders who then used that suffering as justification for their own brutality. The Spanish enslaved, murdered, and exploited the survivors while claiming moral superiority based on their opposition to human sacrifice. The legacy of Aztec warrior culture survived in fragments, embedded in colonial documents and archaeological remains that would be discovered centuries later by scholars attempting to understand how a civilization could organize itself so completely around institutionalized violence. But the living tradition died with the last warriors who remembered what it felt like to climb temple steps with beating hearts in their hands, believing they were feeding gods who would ensure the continuation of the universe itself. In the end, the Aztec warriors had been both victims and perpetrators of a system that consumed human life on an industrial scale. Their military prowess had been real, their dedication absolute, and their courage undeniable, but they had devoted these qualities to serving a civilization that had convinced itself that murder was a cosmic necessity, that suffering was divine currency, and that the universe itself depended on the systematic destruction of human life. The Spanish conquest didn't just end the Aztec Empire. It ended one of history's most complete examples of a society that had organized itself entirely around the principle that human existence was valuable only insofar as it could be transformed into death. The warriors who had served this system died knowing that their life's work had been revealed as meaningless, their gods as powerless, and their civilization as fundamentally unsustainable. Their story serves as a reminder that even the most sophisticated military systems and religious justifications cannot ultimately overcome the fundamental truth that civilizations built on the systematic destruction of human life carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. The Aztec warriors had learned to kill with perfect efficiency, but they had never learned to live with the consequences of their actions. In the end, that failure proved more decisive than any Spanish weapon.